Welcome, everyone. Welcome to all the delegates in the room, to all the delegates online. I'm really excited to be hosting this conversation. And thank you, Abzena, for that introduction. I'm Nidhi Sahni. I am a partner at the Bridgespan Group. This conversation to me is particularly exciting. We've had so many discussions across so many rooms about no matter what the issue, whether it's climate change, whether it's democracy, education, healthcare, you name it. The reason we are working on the outcomes that are so horrendous in so many cases today is because the systems that are in place today have been set up to create the outcomes that we have today and to really move to a world where we have different outcomes for the next generations, for the generations to come. We have to be looking at approaches that are disrupting the systems that are there, questioning power that is there, and creating new systems. And there are many people that are going to play a role. Systems entrepreneurs are a key part of it, individuals, activists, government, private sector, and philanthropy. So today we are going to talk to wonderful friends and colleagues in philanthropy to really see what they have learned and unlearned over their years in this work and how they're approaching philanthropy when it comes to enabling this long-term change that the world so desperately needs. So I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to dive into a 35, 40-minute conversation on the panel. We will then open it up to 20 minutes of Q&A. We also had a prep call, and if that was any indicator, the panel could go on for hours because of our enthusiasm for this topic. So we have given each other permission to generously nudge ourselves along if we get overly enthusiastic about a comment. So if you see us doing that, we do it out of love for each other. So with that, let me introduce Bernadette Moffat, who is the Executive Director of ELMA Philanthropies. Bernadette's journey into philanthropy is inspiring. After a successful career as a commercial litigator in DC, Bernadette returned to South Africa during the birth of democracy. Starting as an entrepreneur, Bernadette's experiences led her to deeply understand the intersection of business, community engagement, and the hardwired inequities in our systems. From setting up a laundry business that emphasized fair labor practices to advocating for women's economic empowerment through microfinance, she's been at the forefront of change. She understands communities and systems and is an entrepreneur at heart, and she brings that to her philanthropy. Please join me in welcoming Bernadette Moffat. Celia Cruz is the CEO of Instituto Beja. With a background as an economist, Celia's passion for social innovation led her through various leadership roles, including leading Ashoka branches across Canada, Paraguay, and Brazil. She has an appreciation and commitment to innovators, in particular bringing people together to work in collaboration to be able to lift up and really create more collective change. Now at Instituto Beja, Celia focuses on supporting the philanthropic ecosystem in Brazil, studying barriers, fostering coalitions for support, and spearheading innovative projects that really promise large-scale change. Join me in welcoming Celia Cruz. And Hilary Pennington is an executive vice president of the Ford Foundation, where she oversees Ford's global grant-making efforts. Over the last decade, Hilary's leadership was characterized by a proactive approach to reevaluating traditional philanthropy, from spearheading initiatives like the BUILD program to challenging the status of grant-making. Prior to the Ford Foundation, Hilary was a director of post-secondary education in the US at the Gates Foundation. But she got her start as a systems entrepreneur and a systems catalyst with Jobs for the Future, where Hilary co-founded and led Jobs for the Future. And over her 22 years, she helped grow it into the most influential organization in the country on issues of education, youth transition, and workforce development. So Hilary brings this experience of being on the front line of systems change to working in two potentially different philanthropies as she thinks about systems change. Join me in welcoming Hilary Pennington. Okay, let's get started. So let's start by just setting some ground context for the delegates in how we are all approaching our understanding of systems change, because we were talking before the panel, people have very different definitions of systems change, and our own personal experiences have helped shape our own definition. So Celia, we'll start with you. Can you share, given either one experience or a series of experiences in your career, how have they shaped your understanding of what is systems change, and what have you learned, and perhaps more importantly, unlearned during those years?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Nidhi, to put this wonderful panel in place. And I'm sorry, I will use some slides because it helps me a lot, and I hope to help you to understand me as well. So what I want to share with you is that that I worked for 9 years with Ashoka, social entrepreneurship, and then with ICE, running particular an ecosystem of impact investing and social business in Brazil. And then I just started 2 months ago at Instituto Beja, so I will bring this knowledge more as a leader of civil society organizations to a foundation. So I will bring my knowledge on how to move from systems change from NGOs to a foundation. And it's important for me also to mention that most of my experience are in Brazil. So I put that Brazil faced huge problems, and most of you know about the Bolsonaro times, so democracy. We are talking about emergency crisis on climate. We are talking about racial issues, justice. We are talking about gender issues, so many issues that probably you have heard about Brazil, but it's where I want you to see most of my examples. And so I also want to bring really fast the inequality on philanthropy and NGO sector. So if I bring a big number for you, Brazil has more than 400,000 millionaires in Brazil. And 70,000 of them have more than $500 million, dollars, not reais. So I made an imagination, a calculation that if 10% of the 400 millionaires would create a foundation, we are talking about 40,000 foundations. Just imagine a number giving $1 million per year. It's a calculation as an economist. But the opposite side is that our Council on Foundation has only 170 foundations. So it's a huge space to grow, but it's sad to know that this inequality that we see also in our sector. And these philanthropies, these foundations, are now giving $1.2 billion per year. The other point is we have more than 800,000 civil society organizations in Brazil, and most of them are run by volunteers with access to no philanthropic capital, or only 2.7% of federal government funds. So we need to really bring these numbers for you to then bring my experience here, first with Ashoka. So as probably most of you know, Ashoka works with social entrepreneurs. So my role in Brazil and in Canada was first to select these social entrepreneurs with a new idea that could create systems change. And my role then in a global fellowship from Washington, but work globally, was how could we connect those social entrepreneurs by themes, water, climate change, journalism, and then connect them with creating synergies and their approach to have that vision much more fast. So that was a way I worked systems change with Ashoka. And then moving back to Brazil after some years, I started as a director of ICE 12 years ago in the early stages of impact investing and social business in Brazil. And in a different approach from individual that can create a social entrepreneur that can create systems change, we start from the beginning looking that we need to build an ecosystem. So it was a different approach. So looking to the ecosystem, who would be the key actors that could create systems change? So we are talking about working with accelerators, incubators. We have more than 300 accelerators, incubators in Brazil. Working with philanthropies, working with government, corporations. And with this approach, we connect 11 funders, and we committed these 11 funders to a long-term 5 years program to really to support from São Paulo to Rio, that was a bigger ecosystem, to think nationally, to think that we need to distribute the governance, to distribute the potential of these ecosystems all over Brazil, in the 5 regions of Brazil, in 6 cities. And here, for me, the big learning is we had to work in different dimensions with 10 different actors at the same time, from the local level to the national level. And this was the brilliant learning, how to think the governance in different levels and bring the local level being represented with the funders and having the knowledge, the trainings, the exchange between local to national and national to local. And also bringing long-term capital. And then I just arrived at the Instituto Beja, and for me it was like a big change in thinking, our goal is to think about the philanthropic ecosystem. Where can it be in 5 years? So it's a foundation supporting the ecosystem of philanthropy. And the way we are doing is, can we really think about a philanthropic sector much more, collaborating much more innovative? And can we use the power of knowledge, the power of advocacy, and the power of innovation to think to how to engage into this vision of the philanthropic sector in Brazil. So that's my new role, and the learning is like 3 to 5 years grant, how to think any of our projects to bring more innovation, to have new ideas that can inspire the philanthropic sector to do different, to use innovation, to use themes that nobody is using, like AI, longevity, racial issues. So that's a little bit of Instituto Beja, and I will come back after.
It's really exciting. It's really exciting. Hilary, let's have you share a little bit of how you understand systems change, and then Bernadette, have you share just briefly, because then let's go into the themes of the long-term arc of change.
So when I think of systems, I think there are many kinds of systems. There are systems that deliver services. They require government, business. And there are also systems that deliver and protect privilege. Those might be systems like patriarchy or corporate monopolies. But to change any of those systems, you need a very complex set of actors and kinds of approaches. I personally love the framework developed by Donella Meadows, and we've used that a lot at Ford. So I'll give you a very brief, Ford has been in existence for 80 years. We've worked on many, many complex issues and systems in that time, and we have not fixed a single problem that we've set out to solve as a foundation. Let me just say that. So when we shifted our focus to focus on inequality 10, 11 years ago, we had to take a really hard look at what had we done, where had we succeeded, where had we failed. I love your frame, Nidhi, on learning. And we had early on really been a big believer that the role of philanthropy is to help develop models and interventions, and the role of government was to scale those models. And we did a lot of work like that across many fields. And we even set up infrastructure like the organizations that do random controlled trials. But what we came to realize is that evidence and demonstrated effect does not actually guarantee success. It doesn't change the systems. And we have, in recent years, let that go because so many other philanthropists are attracted to that kind of philanthropy, especially people of high net worth coming into philanthropy. And we are focusing on the end of Donella Meadows' spectrums, which is the rules of the game, power dynamics, and changing hearts and minds. And so that means basically how, rather than figuring out how to get cash to people who are poor, how do you change the rules that affect predatory lending? Thinking about power dynamics, one reason systems don't change is that the people most affected by those systems aren't at the table. And that's something you asked us to think a little bit, and I'll close out here, about our own personal experiences, which was an interesting question for me. And I had heard a podcast recently with LaTanya Mapp where she said, you know, you experience a first injustice or unfairness before the age of 5, and that becomes a thing about how you see the rest of the world and the rest of your work in the world. And for me, it was 2. I'm half South African. Bernadette and I were talking about it, and was growing up in the racialized apartheid between South Africa and St. Louis, Missouri. But more than that, I have a sister who was born 2 months before my father died with cognitive disabilities. And my then single working mother was told, and in the days before there were laws in the United States for individuals with disabilities that came later through the disability justice movement and giants like Judy Heumann and others. And so my mother was first told, you have to institutionalize her. There's no services for someone like that. She refused to do that. She was able to find schools that my sister could go to when she was a young child, but there was nothing for her by the time she became an adolescent, and she was bused to what was then called the public school district in St. Louis, which was a segregated dumping ground, primarily for Black and brown children in the city. And after that, my mother decided, you know, she needs a certification and a sense of professional identity. And she figured out kind of an apprentice system with Children's Hospital in St. Louis for my sister so that she could become certified as a nurse's aide. And she did that job, was a gifted, gifted caregiver, never made more than minimum wage over the course of all of the time that she did that work. So what I learned from that is that first of all, systems do produce the result that they are designed to produce. It is not a mistake that they end up excluding certain kinds of people, first. Second, governments and laws really matter. You can, and I think we should talk, I hope we do, about the fiction in some ways of social entrepreneurs being able to go it alone, because I think it's much more interesting to think about systems innovators and how we do that together. So government would be my second observation. And then last, it really, really is true that the people who are best positioned to change a system are the people who experience its inequities. And they have to be at the table, and they have to be part of systems design. And that makes me, you know, that's complicated work. And it's been controversial in some cases for Ford to shift away from doing what we used to do and who we used to support, to supporting new kinds of people, different kinds of voices, and getting them at power tables. But I think that's part of the change that needs to happen. So.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Essentially, Hilary and Celia really set the landscape for us for systems change. I think we at ELMA come at it. We are a relatively young philanthropic organization. 18 years. And I have been part of it for 18 years. When we started, our focus is Africa. And our objective is to improve the lives of children in Africa. And so we said, there are organizations such as Ford, lots of philanthropic organizations, much older than us, who have done a lot. And our approach was actually to make change. It has to be systems change. But how do you go about it when you are a new kid on the block? And so we did quite a lot of experimentation. And what we've learned is systems change is complex and it is multi-generational. And it is not a joke that you could be there for 80 years doing amazing work and not changing really one system. And I think we need to embrace that complexity. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we then, as philanthropy, fund into that complexity? When often we are driven by very specific issues. So in South Africa, the most unequal society in the world, We have a situation where the majority of the population has been excluded from the economic benefits. Yes, we are 30 years into our democracy, but it has made some difference to poor people, but it has not changed fundamentally the inequality in that society. And so after experimenting, a lot of our funding goes into healthcare. There are obvious needs there. There are obvious needs in education. And we came to a place where we thought all the money we are putting into education, we aren't really seeing any movement. And we thought, actually, how do you essentially set young children up for success and therefore basically getting possibly them and future generations out of poverty? And our focus was early childhood development. We looked for the system. The system didn't exist. Young children essentially are the responsibility of their mothers or their grandmothers. The state does not provide much for them. They don't have a voice, so they are not seen by a lot of philanthropy or bilateral development. And so we decided that was the entry point to addressing this issue of inequality. It's been 16 years in which we've had to develop a collaboration of not just funders, but also civil society actors. And how do you bring funders and civil society actors around the table without that power dynamic? I believe it is only possible if you respect the local actors who are dedicated to moving it could be in some instances a small lever. And what I learned as well was many philanthropists doing it as charity, they personally get a whole lot from it. And they really they have a vision that they want to put in place. And then you come to a country unequal as South Africa, and you want to build a fancy place, a fancy ECD center. Well, you're only going to help 50 children at most. But you're going to expend huge resources. When you look at the reality of who is caring for young kids, it is poor women in their homes. While Hilary said laws are important. Well, in South Africa, where we actually do have a social network provided by government, what we found was the laws, the regulations, excluded government funding going to these poor women who were providing the majority of childcare. Yeah. So we've been part of a collaboration of, I think at this point, we started as two funders. We got criticized because we left our lane. And we were told we're getting into implementation, and implementation is the role of civil society. And I do agree with that some. But we needed to provide leadership. And our view was we didn't have enough money to impact any part of that system. So we needed to find like-minded thinkers, and we found a local South African foundation that was focusing on young children. And we just said, actually, we don't have enough money together to shift the system. But let's start and go out there and try and find other funders, particularly local funders. We found that we were asking for a quantum of money because we wanted to scale and we needed big money. We were asking for basically the equivalent now of $1 million commitment. That was not the kind of money that business or philanthropy was willing to give local a local initiative. What I learned in trying to go after working with local funders is that sometimes the role that a global philanthropy can play is de-risk. Because we started, but we were knocking on doors, global philanthropy, local philanthropists. And UBS optimists said, wow, this is interesting. We'll come in. And they joined the philanthropy, they joined the collaborative. It was a collaborative of funders, but it would not have been possible for any level of progress if we did not treat civil society organizations that had been working for years in the sector as partners and accept their leadership on where the money, this pooled fund we had, was to be invested. And so for me, the big takeaway is we've got to embrace the complexity. We've got to embrace the complexity. We've got to honor the local champions because they understand when the system comes to a grinding halt, which it so often does when you are trying to do systems change. And you are not the only player. And you're not the most important player. And your money is not the most important thing.
I thought we were.
And maybe I should stop there.
That has given us a lot of threads to pull. So there are a couple tensions that have come up in what we've heard. Let's start with, Hilary, you said Ford has not solved any problem. Bridgespan did research, and I think it said the median time to create change is 45 years. And we were talking about car seats. We were not talking about norms and rules of law, right? And with car seats took 45 years, we can only imagine lifelong inequities. So I imagine a lot of social entrepreneurs and leaders are sitting there and saying, yeah, we know that. Yeah. We're in this work, but how is it that funding does not flow in a way that allows us those multiple decade purviews? So talk about that tension between holding this reality of it takes generations and as a philanthropist, thinking about your grant-making, near-term wins, markers of success. How do you balance that, and where have you seen progress, and where do you think progress still needs to be made? Yeah. Hilary, do you want to?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. So that's a really hard problem we all have to be in together and be honest about. So that is the same thing we have found looking back over Ford's history as well.
Everything that we count as a big success the foundation worked on for 20, 30, 40 years, and we have a belief, we use these simple words, we invest in individuals, institutions, and ideas, but that's actually serious. So part of it is investing in fellowships of human beings who do catalytic work across their lifetimes, right? But then those individuals have ideas that are bigger than them, and they need to raise money to support organizations. The single most important thing that any society needs as issues change is organizations that have enough stability in their funding and predictability in that funding to be themselves the first movers and the innovators, and not to have to wait for foundations to figure it out and change their programs so that they can give them money. So we, with Bridgespan's help, early in my tenure there, did an analysis of just the nature of our funding. Our program officer said, we're really proud, we fund organizations for 10, 15 years. We did. We gave those organizations 1 year project grants every single year for 10 or 15 years. How messed up is that? It never let them have the predictability to hire people, to have a new idea, to be confident that they could build something out, to collaborate, to have enough security to collaborate with others because of the scarcity model in the nonprofit sector. And 70% of our money was spent in that way. So we did a couple of things. We created something called the Build Program, which gives now five-year grants, general support grants, but we learned that money was also supposed to help strengthen those organizations. And we knew from experience that the one thing we had to specify in a project-like way is what they would spend on themselves to get stronger. Because you care about the work, you're trying to get the work done, you starve yourselves. So that has been a very, very powerful thing that originally was somewhat resisted by program staff because it came top down from management. But the most exciting thing in the foundation is that today, 5, 6 years later, I'm looking at Vic, who works on our build team, 70% of the grant making in the Ford Foundation is now multi-year general operating support, without inside build and outside of build. So which should not be praised too much, because it's a step in the right direction, but the problem still remains. What happens when those grants run out? We've done, I would say, a very bad job of changing the practices in the rest of the sector. And I think, there's many questions we should all be asking ourselves about that, because the reality is it's going to take an ecosystem of funders over multiple years, but we have to change the norms of how we see the length of time, not the length of time that makes the change, but the length of time you have to fund the people who are making the change. And that's a really hard thing. One thing I'll just finally say, I think collaborative funds are both exciting and disappointing to me, because they could theoretically be a space which de-risked, to your great point, Bernadette, for funders that don't fund in that way. If I join this collaborative fund that you've created to increase childcare, it automatically means I will spend my money in multi-year general operating support grants. That should be the default, in my view, of any collaborative fund that does any work anywhere. But too often the funders talk amongst themselves first. They figure out the rules, and then they go to the place that's going to house the fund and say, this is the way it's going to operate. So we have a lot of work to do, and we need pressure from all of you. To me, the last thing I'll say is that one of the best outcomes of Build is that not only our grantees, but others in other organizations know they have the right to ask for that kind of funding. And they should. That is one way in which we will slowly change philanthropy.
Thank you. Celia, if we pick up that theme of changing philanthropy, right? You just said your new role is about impacting philanthropy. So how are you thinking about setting it up from the start so you're not undoing?
First,
right? Future?
When she mentioned 45 years, I just looked to Chris, the founder, and she said, we are going to change the ecosystem of philanthropy in 5. So
yeah, good for you.
It is a huge challenge, and I can see, if I say 45 years in Brazil, I think people will kill me. But at least I have an experience with 10 years change in the ecosystem of impact investing and social business. And I saw the role of philanthropy to de-risk. So when we are bringing, can philanthropy use other financial instruments beyond grants?
Yeah.
Can they use loans, guarantees, equity? Everybody said, no, it's not about us. And then we put 20 foundations to de-risk. And after those 5 years, we could pass a national policy in Brazil. And then because of this de-risk, people understood what was social business. They understood impact investment. And then the government entered, then the corporations entered. So it was really a good point on de-risking. And I always look also, what are the low-hanging fruits and the long term? Because if we just say 45 years, no, but there are some low-hanging fruits, and I will give an example of Instituto Beja in this, sometimes like convene. We call ourselves that we are field catalyst, and we need to enter in the system, made some different roles, because we know a lot of times we will leave. But as a de-risk, we are in the middle of the tax reform in Brazil. And you probably are going to be a little bit shocked, but in Brazil, we tax donations. So it's horrible. And we are trying to change this. And then Chris realized, can we use this tax tax reform to create a coalition to solve this problem in a collective way? So it was a really fast movement. So that for me is like the vision, intuitive sometimes, but then put in place a coalition and fund them with, we are the secretariat, we fund the moderator, the facilitator, we enter with some capital, to support this coalition. But then beyond not solving yet because the tax reform is there, but solving these two issues on the tax reform, we connect everyone in a much bigger vision. Can we work together for the next 5 years to really think about the regulatory system for philanthropy and NGOs together?
Who are you working with in that? Celia, can you give examples?
The GIFI, who is probably, perhaps is here, is our foundation center. We have the ABONG, the National Association of NGOs. We have lots of philanthropies, like Fundação José Egídio Setúbal. Of course, Beja is the convener and the secretariat and the funder at this point. And we have also 5 law firms working them. Some paid, but most of them entering because they also believe in the sector. So I like this example because it took us sometimes like, can we take risk? Mm-hmm. Can we fund? Can we convene? Mm-hmm. So it's different roles as a field catalyst that Beja can do and then present in a different way what is the recommendation of this coalition for the whole philanthropic sector? What are the recommendations of this coalition for the whole civil society sector? So that's a little bit about creating, and it's generational also because then we committed to stay there. We need to change the secretariat. Sometimes it's not so easy, that part. But I think that was an example that can take long to make changes.
Perfect, thank you. If we think about collaboration, I think many people have mentioned, I think Hilary, you mentioned about governments working. I think you've mentioned about working with law firms and nonprofits, the work that you are doing with civil society as well as funders. We've also heard a theme around, we are living in a world right now that is so polarized, right? There is so much polarization, there is so much misinformation, there is, some would say, ideological purity in some segments that are having people pull back. People are retreating from things they have committed to right now. There is fear of making a mistake. Mm-hmm. And if the very ingredients of systems change is collaboration, across often, kind of uncommon partners. How does one in a world like today bring together partners that might actually disagree on a few things, but have to work together? Right? We spoke about this in our pre-meeting. There's a funder in West Africa that's working on tax reform, and they have to work with feminist movements on the ground, on the front lines, and the IMF, and the government, and they don't always get along on various perspectives. So how, I would love for you to comment on what is the role of a foundation in creating the connective tissue, in actually addressing that enabling environment for collaboration?
You should start. You want to start?
I think probably the most important is what Celia said, is the convening power that we have, that you can convene, you have a power to convene, and because you represent resources, people do listen to you. Maybe sometimes more than they should, because, but I think that power is really important to understand and to, again, embrace and bring people into a room knowing that they are not exactly going to agree on absolutely everything, but identifying what is that common thing that you do all agree on and focus on the positive. I think it's really important that as we collaborate with government, with civil society, there's huge distrust between government and civil society. They do not often see eye to eye. And I have found that we have been useful in trying to be the interlocutor between civil society and government so that they can understand each other. Civil society, unfortunately, in this polarized world, is often seen as in opposition to government. those of us who are on the brink of election know how difficult it is for our partners as they are trying to position themselves. If there's a government change, what happens to, we have partners who've been involved in youth employment, creating job opportunities for youth. We were reflecting last night that actually the fact that it's named the Presidential Initiative, 5 years ago it was a big plus. Now on the eve of an election where the president might lose, it is a huge risk. And so I think you have to be really nimble, and you really cannot afford to do it alone. I mean, there's always a lead in all the collaborations we have been in, where there is a lead partner. And in our case, it's in the area of youth job creation. It is Yellowwood's Harambee. Harambee as the implementer and Yellowwoods as the main funder. And I just think we all come to the table. We have different connections into government. And so if you've developed trust with your collaborating partners over a period, when they hit a bump in the road on an issue, they can come to you to say, can you help open that door that they might not have the capital to open the door with? And so I think really the very important thing is the flexibility, the ability to defer to others who might have better expertise in that moment. And we all don't have the best expertise all the time.
Hilary, do you want to add to that, and then we'll transition
Yeah,
to Q&A?
I don't think we are very good at that in my institution. It's a very hard problem. You know, we are seen by our partners and by our enemies as the cash machine for the progressive movements in the United States and around the world. And when there are existential threats, as there are in times of elections, it's very, very easy to feel that you have to fight and win. Someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And I think the thing we are trying to get smarter about as an institution is that's exactly what the polarizers want us to do. And it's exactly how they want us to be. And polarization isn't going to go away because this kind of polarization doesn't just naturally occur. It's a political project. And so the only way, you know, we have to resist falling into the binaries. So we're trying to get better at that in many of the ways you just described, Bernadette. So we're trying to do some work, for example, in the middle of the United States, and we've chosen to work on two issues, opioids and internet access, because those are relatively easier issues to work on. And that means where there are funding partners and other implementing partners who are different than we have to listen to them genuinely to understand, not to convince. That's really hard for us to do. We have to look for the first small step we can take that builds a little bit of trust and then take the next step. But I think that makes it sound easy, and it's not easy. It's going to stay hard, and I think mis and disinformation are going to make it harder. So I think we all have to be much, much smarter than we have yet been about how not to fall into the trap of being ourselves polarizer, because on every issue that we all work on, that's going to be the climate going forward because of the uncertainties and inequities that exist in the world that we live in. So I think that we have now got a global initiative on polarization for exactly this reason, which is to try to understand it better, to try to get better ourselves, and to try to find the people that are doing the best work and connect them to each other and accelerate what they're able to do with each other, because we have to get, the people who want to fight against it have to get smarter and more effective really fast. So.
Thank you. We're going to transition to Q&A right now because I'm getting 3 times I've been given a sign. So let's move. We're going to take 3 questions, and then we're going to bring it back to our panelists. So we'll take 3 questions at the same time. I can't see because of the bright lights, so I'm going to trust our colleagues with a mic. If we can go there to the lady, yes, down there. So we'll take one question there. Yes, sure.
So, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I'm just going to
hola.
make one request. Let's make the question short and brief, and let's
Okay.
make it a question, and we'll save comments for later.
Awesome. So, hola. Hi, I'm Luana Genot. I work with racial justice, climate change, and gender justice, and I have two quick questions. I wanted to hear your thoughts about intersectionality and how can we train more funders to see things in an intersectional way. Just because when we are talking about race, we are also talking about democracy, or we are talking about gender and climate justice, but sometimes funders have a huge trouble to see the intersectionality among those topics, and I want to hear your thoughts on how can we train them to see intersectionality and fund that as a system orchestrators, and also about how can we fund things beyond the US, because sometimes we talk a lot about global philanthropy, but that is very concentrated in the global north.
Yep.
So how can we go beyond that? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go at the back, right over there, to that lady.
Thank you so much. My name is Guhe. I wanted to ask a question to Hilary. That was a really great, succinct description of different types of systems. When we think about how systems of privilege interact with systems of delivery and how often philanthropy is a big part of who gets funding, how, and it is an intervener within systems, how does philanthropy think of itself as a system actor? As Bernadette said, it can be a very powerful one and it can be a fast mover, but can also be a perpetuator of holding onto a lot of power. How does philanthropy situate itself within a system so that it's not perpetuating some of the same harms?
Thank you. And perhaps right at the back.
Hello, I've got a question about equity. What are your solutions to the challenge of measuring equitable system change unless we capture and measure those who are most left behind to see whether they're either included or excluded? How do we really get to that last piece of the most challenging, those left behind? Thank you.
Perfect. Let's take those three, and if we have time, we'll go back for some others. So, if we can even combine the first and the last one, right? When we think about intersectionality and the equity that's hardwired in all of the issues that we're working on, whether it's race, whether it's gender, if you think about democracy, climate, how are each of you thinking about that intersectionality, and how do you measure inclusive, equitable systems? I don't know if someone wants to. Bernadette, do you want to?
Yeah. I think this issue of measurement is part of the problem. I respect that we need to hold ourselves accountable. But if we insist on measuring everything, we then have to just focus on outputs and not on the outcome. And so I think the one thing we need to teach funders, particularly global North funders, is really to work with local partners and understand that the people at the local level are the people who are closest to the problem and are on a daily basis struggling with the solution. And your money can help them accelerate what they're doing. So we are right now really focused on how do we empower local actors, whether they be at the community level, or they are at the national level, or they're working Pan-African. It is really important for us to pay attention to how do we build resilient, whether it's African or Asian or North American or South American, how do we build local resilient organizations who are going to be able to continue on the effort long after our philanthropists have lost interest in that particular issue. And the intersectionality, we have to, these problems are not in a silo. I mean, we see that now with the HIV issue.
Yeah.
We built all these systems, these vertical systems to address HIV. Now, yes, a lot of progress was made, but now we have essentially polarized health systems all over Africa. Nurses who can only work on HIV.
Yeah.
Why? Because the funder said this money is just for HIV. Yeah. But this same patient also has malaria. Mm-hmm. So we have to constantly hold ourselves accountable to the intersectionalities that exist in people's lives.
Thank you. Celia.
I first will say about the, how to really create this intersectional. For me, is really working on a systemic approach. So, and like you said, if I'm talking about justice, racial justice, or climate change, we need to see all the perspectives, from the gender, from the where the just transition, how I use the concept of how can put Black people in power of foundations, how can we put, in our case, we are looking really how to engage foundations in this change. So in all the themes that we are selecting, we try to see like problems, solutions in a more systemic approach. So it is an exercise that we are reviewing at Beja, as we saw about foundation and the philanthropic ecosystem, as well as by theme that we are looking for. And one thing that has been changing a lot, but it needs to change much more, like from Instituto Beja, we are giving 3 to 5 years grant. We are talking about unrestricted capital, and Ford Foundation had a really big responsibility in putting this into globally. And so how can we really trust our grantee to say, look, it's not about control, it's about to see where you want to go. And if we have the same vision, or if we see their vision and it's close to where we can engage, I think it's much better to understand like the vision, and we are putting in our hands how we are going to look for the impact, not to ask them to fill reports and reports. But the reality, when I was in the other coalition, although we convinced 11 funders to have the same report, there is a lot about control and not about trust.
Yeah.
And it makes us as a secretariat or us as a foundation to replicate what the pressure of the foundations are doing. Control, control, and then the speech is trust, trust, trust. Yeah. But so I'm really happy that in Beja, we are trying to go to this 3 to 5 years, unrestricted capital, collaborate with them, and putting the grantees together with the philanthropies in their journey, because and also our team. So in this journey, that we are going to give trainings, that we are going to give support, that we are going to collaborate using our networks to support them, we are in the same room with other foundations, because I don't need to do all the trainings. We can use some of the trainings of other foundations. I just saw Rodrigo here, so we are talking about what trainings they are giving that we don't need to give. And how can we together change our mindset about really trust and see the vision and see how we connected several grantees in this topic in a really more intersectional way to put them together. And I think a lot of foundations have this systemic approach and the collaboration approach, but we are in the early stage to do this big movement.
I would say what they said, and maybe just to add 2 things. I think in a technical way, one of the best ways to get around some of these issues is to provide general support. Hate to say it, but then let the organization decide whether it's malaria or HIV or however it is they want to do it. I heard a very interesting word yesterday used by a venture capitalist who was talking about intersectionality, and he used the word, that's a multi-solve approach. And I thought, that's interesting. So I think sometimes our own language doesn't help us. The way we have to be smart about translating what we see so that the people that we are trying to convince to change their behavior make the road a little easier for them. But in the end, to the question about philanthropy and power, that is a fundamental problem with this system because philanthropy is never accountable for the changes that it makes. So I would say there are things foundations themselves can do in making sure your board has people who come out of the nonprofit sector and who have experience being grant seekers themselves. I was that. Darren, the president of our foundation, is that. Always on our board, we have 3 or 4 grantees. That makes a big difference to how we think. We have a dashboard that we look at every year, and every year we ask every program, what percentage of your grantees are new this year? What percentage of the grants that you make in your strategy are general operating support? What percent are multi-year grants? There's not a right answer. We're not prescribing, but starting techniques like that get you in the practice of at least having to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it and where your own practices might not line up with the change you seek to make in the world. And then the last thing I would just say for those of you who do the hard work of grant seeking, don't give over your agency to foundations. In a funny way, foundations do love to be criticized by their grantees. They just don't do anything as a result of the criticism. So though, what I would say is criticize and then give a solution. Say, the way in which you are doing this work is problematic for us. If you did these 3 things differently, it would work better. Make sure that groups of you who know you're funded by the same foundation start to say the same kinds of things. And I think that, not to put it back on you, it's on us. But I think there can be a kind of learned helplessness that happens both in the foundations and in the field. And somehow, with all of our help, we've got to break that. Because we're just not working in the way we need to work.
Thank you. Before I go to our final question, I wanted to pick up Hilary where you left because I think that's so powerful. Are there any thoughts, Bernadette? You and Celia have 4 entrepreneurs in how they can continue to challenge philanthropy, challenge the power that philanthropy has, and be a part of creating the change in the philanthropic system. Any other recommendations, guidance?
I think it is to hold funders accountable, is ask them questions. Mm-hmm. Often we meet civil society partners and we are asking all the questions and we are holding you accountable for the work that you are doing. But it's very seldom that I get questions to explain yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember pretty much only one time when in the social justice sector, we had several incidents of sexual harassment. And a group, and for ELMA and a couple of other funders were the main funders in that sector. And there were 3 grantees that came together, and it actually was painful that they did not feel independently they could approach us. And they had to form a coalition to approach us. And those of us who think of ourselves as social justice advocates, it's the mirror, that is what but it was the only time that we were held accountable because we had all heard the rumors, but the perpetrators were people everybody respected. And how can I be the first one to point a finger at somebody who is a legend in social justice. And I think it took a moment, and in fact, that incident led to the funders in the social justice sector coming together and examining our practices with relation to sexual harassment and gender inequality. And that group meets still today. And this was 7 years ago.
Yeah, 7 years ago.
Amazing. Thank you.
It's a new role of 2 months. And we, after a trip to India, Chris decided to bring a center on exponential change that some of you here know. Sanjay and Societal Thinking and Skoll is coming in a partnership and New Profit and Rohini Philanthropies. So, and then we brought the vision to Brazil and start convening people and discussion. And like Chris mentioned, it's like I received so many friendly tomatoes in this. That's really hard because we are talking about bringing a new topic on like AI for philanthropy and civil society. And our vision was, if we don't bring civil society to work with this super risky topic, who is educating the robots are not these people in this room, are the ones we are trying to fight with. And so we received so many points, like before receiving the question, say, why? What are your vision? What's it? It was like, we are against, from the right to left, everyone. So sometimes like try to see like how we have an entrepreneurial funder that is also having visions on what's also important to Brazil. But just to have to finalize this example that sometimes people are just like asking for money and not asking also how we are wanting to convene to a new topic. And we decide that we need also to fund an advocacy for regulating AI in Brazil. Not only to respond to them, but to say, look, we are entering here in a super serious topic. It is a vision that we need to participate in this AI or how to bring digital to scale all the solutions that we need for that most of the people can have access to good education, health. But can we enter in a dialogue? And so we are mapping who is who, what's the concept behind, who is working on this, to really enter in a more careful way to really bring the dialogue with people who are in the sector also. So it's just to complete with your point here.
Thank you. So as we wrap up this session, we could go on forever, but I want to wrap up on hope. So as each one of you, and we can, we'll go to each one of you on this one, as you think about 2024, right? We talk a lot about the elections around the world in 2024. In Brazil, right, we are hosting the G20 in Brazil. There's a lot happening in the context that we are all working in. What at this point is giving you hope?
I find the most hope. Ford is very, very fortunate to make investments in global fellows. A number of them are here in this room. So those are individuals who are working to fight inequality in their various countries and contexts. And there's no adaptive thing faster than a human being. So their vision and the ways in which they're changing how they think about the work gives me hope, a lot of hope.
And you're clapping for the global fellows.
You're clapping for them, I know, exactly.
What gives me hope is young people. I think we too often kind of invest in people who are similar to us, whether they are of our same culture or our age or our gender. We have to invest in young people. And
the thoughts that we are getting from some of the young leaders that have emerged are just so exciting. But it's also quite threatening because they think in ways that are not similar to ours when it comes to an approach to solving problems. And I am excited about the opportunity of getting behind some young people and giving them the opportunity to address these apparently intractable issues.
And one thing I love about young people, they're not going to put up with philanthropic strategies. They will crowdsource. They will figure out a way to hack the systems that we all are in, and they should, right?
So first, it's a privilege to have G20 and the COP30 in Brazil. I hope all of you come. I don't know if you fit in Belém, that's a small city, but that's not for me to figure out. But what I really love is that Brazil, with the G20, is creating a really much more participatory way, so you can enter in different, like T20, C20, Women's 20. There is lots of really big group, and I believe most of the people who are here, who are from Brazil, are really seeing the power of a more diverse leadership in this. So Brazil is giving much more the space for from the racial issues, from gender issues, LGBT, Amazon people, to bring their voice before the G20 to design the recommendations. And I really hope that the COP next year will bring these voices, that they are participating in this process to really be there at the COP20, not just in the outside rooms or in the out-COP meetings, but really bringing their voice. Like I hear, like women, a trans women participate in this conversation and say, I'm from a young person from the Amazon. I need to be there talking what I feel from the Amazon. So I think that gives me a lot of hope. And on the philanthropic side is really to understand our field catalyst role, not just as grant maker, but how can we really understand where we can make a difference and when we need to get out and leave the leaders of that themes to be brilliant and to flourish. So hope to see all of you at the COP and the next year in Brazil, or in the G20 as well.
Thank you. So in closing, I want to thank all of you for your engagement. Hilary, Bernadette, Celia, thank you. I'm taking a lot from this. You know, the three things I'm sitting with is for all the philanthropists, philanthropies, philanthropy advisors in the room, what are the couple things we need to unlearn coming out of this conversation? What are the assumptions we need to challenge? And how do we take that lens into how we approach 2024? For all of us, how are we collaborating, listening to learn, not to convince? I love that. How are we listening to learn from people we are not always in community, getting out of our echo chambers and truly building those collaborations? And the permission to hold up the mirror. I love that, permission to hold up the mirror. I spoke to a social entrepreneur yesterday who said no to a philanthropist who was offering the social entrepreneur funding because it came contingent on a partnership. This was a few years ago, and fast forward a few years, the social entrepreneur got 5x that from the same philanthropist. So I would encourage us all to be able to hold up that mirror and say no. So thank you for that, and thank you all, and we will look forward to the rest of Skoll together.